Hi, everyone. It is an honor and a privilege to be in a room where we're doing an event actually both live and online. So this is awesome. I thank you all very much for coming. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce today, as we start our discussion of this really important topic, the Marshall Plan at 75 and what lessons we might be able to draw from it for the situation in Ukraine today. I'd like to introduce Ambassador Mark Green, who will talk to us a little bit about some of the work of the center. Before I do, though, I have a couple of thank yous, so Ambassador, forgive me while I do those. I would like to welcome our honored guest from the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation, President Ambassador Wolfgang Pettrich. Your career-defining work on the Western Balkans needs no introduction, I'm sure, to this audience. Thank you so much to you and your team for being here and for enabling this event. Vielen herzlichen Dank. I'd also like to thank our colleagues from the Österreichisches Institut für Internationale Politik, the Austrian Institute for International Affairs in the American lingo. Okay. For those of you who don't know Ambassador Green, and I cannot imagine that there are many of you, his earlier work as executive director of the McCain Institute and administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development has been invaluable to us here at a time when we are facing these global challenges and particularly demands on development assistance. With democratic governments seeking new ways to cooperate effectively, Ambassador Green's work as president of the International Republican Institute, president and CEO of the Initiative for Global Development, and senior director at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition gives us insight into just how we might manage that challenge. He was also ambassador to Tanzania from 2007 to 2009, so he knows firsthand the difficulties of translating policy into progress on the ground. Best of all, his background as a four-term member of the U.S. House of Representatives representing Wisconsin's 8th District, which I feel I must say, is in itself an illustration of the idea behind the Wilson Center, a think tank created by Congress as a nonpartisan policy forum for tackling tough issues. Ambassador Green, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Robin, for those kind words. As you just heard, I am Mark Green, and welcome everyone to the Wilson Center. As you just heard, Congress itself actually established the Wilson Center some 5 decades ago for the purpose, in their words, of strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. They asked us to go beyond opinion and spin and to pursue scholarship and learning. And so our currency is knowledge, our focus is independent analysis, and our purpose is developing options and recommendations that decision makers can believe in. And as you also heard, we are fiercely nonpartisan. And that really makes the Wilson Center the perfect place for today's discussion of the Marshall Plan and its lessons for us in the current context. I would also like to thank the Austrian Marshall Plan for its ongoing work with the Wilson Center, and in particular, of course, its contributions today. June 5th was the 75th anniversary of Secretary of State George Marshall's speech to Harvard graduates. He gave a remarkably succinct statement, one that I hoped he probably hoped other members of the State Department would follow as diplomats. I'm not sure that's always taken place. It was a short speech, but it was a short speech about a big idea, an idea that resonated up through the present. It was this: with post-war Europe, cities destroyed, food production and supply really disrupted, ruined transportation infrastructure, that was breaking supply chains and disrupting trade. He argued that it was in America's interest, it was in the world's interest, to help Europe get back on its feet. Marshall's vision would see the coordination of reconstruction assistance dollars, spurring recovery, supporting economies, and yes, strengthening democracy. The U.S. investment in both wartime allies and former enemies paid dividends in far beyond economic terms. It brought and continues to bring a trust dividend on both sides of the Atlantic. It was, in so many ways, the beginning of our transatlantic partnership. And so before we get going in our discussion with this great panel that's up here, let me give you a quick transatlantic example of my own. We have 2 video messages to get things going. In the first, we are honored to hear from Austria's President, His Excellency Alexander Van der Bellen. The second is from the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. We are honored to have them both with us virtually here today, and both will give their perspective on the living history, which is the legacy of the Marshall Plan. I know this will just be the first part of this discussion, but I think it is key that we remember history, we remember the principles behind that history, and we look to learn the lessons that can help us with the important challenges we see today, challenges which are likely to get even greater tomorrow. So with that, Robin, I'll turn to you to cue up the videos.
Okay. With this, I'm going to ask our colleagues who are doing the tech to please roll those videos for us and thank them for doing so. I have no control from here, just letting you know.
Ladies and gentlemen, 75 years ago, the Marshall Plan was set into action, and as a result, billions of dollars poured into the West European economies in the years between 1948 and 1952. The so-called economic miracle of the post-war years was, to a large extent, the result of the Marshall Plan. I, however, prefer to see it less as a miracle and more as a boost. Not only did it boost the economy, it also boosted morale and built trust and confidence. Only through re-establishing a functioning economy and democratic institutions in Europe, it was possible to strengthen democracy. This sense of hope and the "we can do it" mindset continues to shine. If we look at Austria today, a country that lay in ruins after World War II, we owe our quality of life, above all, to George Marshall's policies. If we look beyond our borders, we see regions hit by crisis, hunger, oppression, destruction, war. In this context, the phrase, "we need a Marshall Plan," becomes relevant. It has become a part of our vocabulary because it was a program which helped hundreds of millions of people. This is what it has become synonymous for. Today, 75 years later, the help provided may look different, but to us, it still has the same considerable value. We still benefit from the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan Foundation funds scholarships and enables transatlantic research. It supports young researchers and innovative startups in their endeavors. It encourages intercultural exchange, and it serves as an important hub for academic discussions. Its programs connect people from all over the world and give them the opportunity to inspire each other, to motivate each other, to learn from each other. And we need to learn from each other, because only together can we work out how to tackle the challenges we face. I would like to thank the Marshall Plan Foundation for its important work, and I would like to congratulate you on this anniversary. Ladies and gentlemen, 75.
Hello, I'm U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, and I want to thank the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation for inviting me to share a few words with you today as we mark the 75th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. It may sound strange to say, but I believe that a 75th anniversary is one of the most important landmarks we can note, because it represents the period at which the original event begins to pass decisively out of the realm of living memory and into that of history. So we are called at moments like this to mark the lessons of the not-so-distant past and weigh what they mean for our moment and for the future. The lasting legacy of the Marshall Plan still reverberates across Europe, including in Austria, where this organization continues its always timely work to support academic discourse, build economic insights, and foster transatlantic partnerships whose relevance is proving in this moment to be as great as ever. The Russian Federation's brutal, unprovoked war in Ukraine has led to a response that has shown the world not only the resilience and heroism of the Ukrainian people, but the power of coordinated and united international action across and even beyond our vital transatlantic partnerships. Meanwhile, the existential threat of the climate crisis will call for a scale of human cooperation never seen before in the world, but one for which the history and memory of the enormous project of post-war European construction holds very important insights and lessons. As President Biden often points out, we are living through a period in which the very future of democracy is on the line. Ours is a time that requires leaders and societies to demonstrate that democracies can deliver for their people better than autocracies. 75 years ago, the Marshall Plan laid the groundwork for generations of peace, prosperity, and progress. It reinforced what Marshall himself called the political and economic conditions in which free institutions can exist. We are the stewards of those free institutions and of the conditions that make their continued success possible. The only way for us to meet our responsibilities in this regard is to continue to do so together. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this event.
Thank you very much. Okay, that sounds like a challenge to me, right? To make sure that we have an event that we all enjoy and that gets lively input from our folks that are participating with us virtually. So let me introduce you to this phenomenal panel that we have here to talk about this issue. First, to my left is Ambassador Wolfgang Petritsch. His work on the issues related to the Balkans surely needs no introduction. He was an exceptional high representative in the OHR in Bosnia and Herzegovina at a critical moment, and the foundation that he established is a model that has been taken for others after him. He's remained engaged in building peace, stability, and strong networks in the region ever since, including when he moved on as Austria's ambassador to the OECD, which fittingly stems from the original organization built to implement the Marshall Plan. So that synergy is there and lasts. So thank you very much for coming today. I'm going to just introduce and then each will speak for a few minutes. So to his left is Ambassador Derek Hogan, my friend from the State Department. He's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. He has terrific experience with European issues, having been our ambassador at the U.S. Embassy in Moldova. He was also the Director of Central European and Nordic and Baltic Affairs at the State Department, in addition to assignments all over the world, including as the Senior Advisor to the President's Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. I cannot think of anybody better to help us interpret the Marshall Plan's legacy for today. And then to his left, Jonathan Katz, a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the U.S. here in Washington and the director of their democracy initiatives. Before he joined them in 2017, he was the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Europe and Eurasia at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And he led aid programs in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and Eastern and Central Europe. So thank you for joining us today. Finally, I'd like to introduce Joe Dressen, a colleague here at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. He is responsible for development issues and managing the Kennan Conversation programs, which I know some of you have tuned into. And he writes and edits a number of Kennan's publications on issues ranging from Russian energy projects to human rights concerns to rule of law issues. So with this stellar panel, I'm going to ask everybody to give a couple of minutes as an opening statement and then go on to what I know will be a vibrant discussion. Ambassador Petritsch, I'm going to turn to you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Robin. And of course, I feel very honored to be in such a wonderful round of experts and great people who have worked in the region, in Europe, which clearly is so important, still continues to be important, particularly since February 24th for Europe. Transatlantic cooperation, as we see this in our Marshall Plan Foundation, as well as at the Institute, Austrian Institute for International Affairs, is key. And for many years now, we in Europe have been discussing the issue: is the United States still a European power, or is it a power in Europe? And since this ominous date, I feel that the return of the United States to Europe is something which, of course, reminds us of 1945 and before World War II. But it is already something that has happened during World War I also. But I think the post-World War II situation was one where we have learned a lot what the United States as the global leader needs to do in order to keep Europe inside its area of interest and try to build a partnership. And I think this is something which we now, in the longer run, need to also sort of envision, I should say, when we talk now about the Ukraine. And of course also, which might not be so popular right now and unimaginable, in the longer term, we have to think of how do we deal with Russia as well. So this is actually quite something, a big thing. But let me start out to state something which is very close to my heart, and which is not just a miracle, not just a myth, not just a boost, as the Austrian president has said. It is reality. The reality of the Marshall Plan really means that without the Marshall Plan, Europe, Western Europe, but now all of the European Union would not be where we are. Europe now belongs to is the richest region in the world. And this is something which would not have been possible without the Marshall Plan. Clearly, there are big challenges when we talk now about the possible Marshall Plan for Ukraine. There are many reasons. First of all, we're still in the middle of the war, and I'm very much concerned about how to end this war. I think we are now confronted with a situation which is very different from the total defeat of Nazi Germany, and in extension Austria, which was part of Nazi Germany at the time. I am afraid a total defeat is not, I don't see it in fact. So we'll have to deal with something, and we have to be prepared for a situation where we'll have an extended period of euphemistically called unpeace, but more so maybe a conflict between Russia and the West. In many ways, this will affect the Europeans much more so than the Americans. And this is one of the concerns why we believe that the lessons from the Marshall Plan in 1947-48 are so important. And one of the lessons is the commitment of the United States to assist and to help Ukraine and, in extension, Europe, to overcome this crisis. The lesson number 2 is you need a plan. The time between 1945 and 1947, the United States spent more funds, more money, that it then did between 1948 and 1952 when the Marshall Plan was implemented and executed. Planning is of crucial importance. Lesson number 3 is cooperation. The United States forced the European post-war countries to cooperate. They established an office in Paris, of all places, and governments had to submit plans for what they would do with the American funds. And I think that this is very important. And here we already see the limits when it comes to Ukraine. Even if the war would be finished, we will probably be confronted with a divided Ukraine. The Ukraine will not be as it used to be in 1991 in terms of borders. How do we deal with this issue? And then how do we deal with another issue, and this is state building, this is democracy building, which sorely lacked in the past 30 years in Ukraine. We have to admit this. We cannot simply return to the post or the pre-24 of February situation. We need to start anew, and this is something which would only work if Ukraine, if Kiev is fully committed to the rule of law, to democracy, to anti-corruption, and in a specific issue in the case of Ukraine, to deal with how should I put it in not too offensive ways, in the robbing of Ukraine public's assets after 1991. The oligarchic system needs to be fully dismantled. A huge thing, but I believe we need to think of it. We need to keep this in mind. So this means if the cooperation, which then eventually was highlighted by the creation of the OEC and then OECD in Paris, that was my last posting there several years ago as Austria's ambassador. This is still a very important organization because it has taught the industrialized countries to cooperate. In the macroeconomic field, but in so many other fields, to compare notes, where we stand, how do we do this, and all this interaction is so important because we live in an age of intervulnerability. We are all affected by it, as it is now being demonstrated with the hunger problems in Africa or in the Middle East, in North Africa, and so on. So this interconnected world, of course, this is the other side of globalization, so to speak. That is something which we need to keep in mind when working on a plan for Ukraine. And the last lesson, or the fourth lesson, there are many more, but here, due to the time constraints, I would say we have to have a vision for the whole region, for Ukraine, but including its neighbor, Russia, and of course the European Union. And this can only be a differentiated vision. Ukraine clearly has the offer now to become a member of the European Union eventually. Yeah, Ukraine will probably, with NATO, we'll see how things work out, but then eventually the situation has to be stabilized, and this is only possible if we try and re-establish, and this will take a long time, in the post-Putin era, halfway meaningful relations with Russia. These are the four lessons which I would draw from the actual situation right now. We don't know how things are going to develop. I think we are in for a long and grinding conflict, military, which we need to be prepared. But we have to commit ourselves. This is only going to be resolved in the long run, and we have to stick together.
Ambassador Petric, I knew I could count on you to give us some challenges, and you have. And so thank you very much indeed. So with that, let me turn to Ambassador Hogan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a delight to be on this panel with you all, as well as to be here at the Wilson Center. This really is an important event. I think it's important to talk about the horrific tragedy of of Russia's war of choice against Ukraine, to recognize the unprecedented transatlantic unity between the United States and our NATO allies and European partners, and also to touch a little bit on the broad contours of our assistance, keeping in the theme of the Marshall Plan. I will save my comments on desired end state, and we can talk about security matters as well in the Q&A. But I'll just focus on the non-military part right now. So, Putin's brutal war of choice against Ukraine has changed Europe for sure, and has only emphasized the importance of American leadership in Europe. Russian forces have killed or wounded thousands, destroyed Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, displaced more than 17 million people, launched a worldwide energy crisis, and set in motion a looming food security tragedy. But our efforts to support Ukraine and address the impacts of Putin's war have changed the course of the conflict and have strengthened our relationships with partners and allies. More than 100 days have passed since the start of this war, a war some had expected to be short, ending in Ukrainian capitulation. Ukraine has proven to be incredibly resilient. And contrary to Putin's goals, the conflict has galvanized European democracies. In fact, I would say it's galvanized much of the world. This would not be possible without the close collaboration between the United States and its allies and partners as we lead a global response to hold Russia to account and to provide critical security, economic, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Our continued mutual resolve will be crucial in the long term as we work together to rebuild Ukraine in the aftermath of the devastation wrought by the Kremlin. The United States is committed to a free and prosperous Europe. Through the Marshall Plan, Americans and Europeans together have contributed to the revival of Europe, and in so doing charted the future development of the democratic world. These ideals are as true today as they were 75 years ago, when the Ukrainian government and people need our help to defend themselves, resist future attacks or coercion, choose their own future, and to prosper. The goals of the Marshall Plan were the same as our shared goals for Europe today. That is, ensuring mutual economic prosperity, providing for transatlantic security, promoting our shared values, and working together to confront global challenges. And like the Marshall Plan, the resources we bring will lie at the heart of our efforts. 75 years ago, we implemented the Marshall Plan with a $13 billion pledge, more than $120 billion in today's dollars, and concept of how to rebuild Europe over the course of 4 years. For Ukraine and the region, we have a similar commitment. The assistance funds the United States is using from 2 supplemental bills in just the last 3 months comes to more than $53.6 billion. And we are delivering this aid in full coordination with our international partners. And thinking about this conceptually, I would put to you that we should think about this in sort of the midterm and then the longer term. The midterm, our efforts are focused in 4 areas. Continuity of government, that is basically providing us the assistance to keep the lights on. Right, so this is our direct budget support. We've already committed $1 billion to that, going through mechanisms to be able to deliver that assistance, direct budget support, and we've got more in the pipeline, roughly $1.5 billion per month over the next 4 to 5 months. Also, societal resilience. So this, we're talking about food security, civil society support, media support, psychosocial support, just dealing with the trauma of being invaded, so the families and the people living there. Security and and resilience. And so here we are focused on the border guards, the national police. What can we do to provide those important law enforcement services the tools they need to try to keep their country as safe as possible, as secure as possible? And finally, accountability, helping the Ukrainians pursue credible acts of atrocities and so forth. So those are some of our midterm bridge building efforts. And then that is, as I said, bridge building for the longer term reconstruction there. And this is getting at some of the issues that my colleague mentioned earlier. So as we think about how and when the war will end, those are the questions we don't know. Our main position, I would just say at the top, really is to provide the tools that the Ukrainians need both on the battlefield as well as at the negotiating table to increase their leverage, to be able to preserve as much as possible their democracy, their sovereignty, their territorial integrity. But thinking about that, what that means in terms of that long-term economic reconstruction, that gets into helping the government return to revenue collection, for example, be able to restore solvency there. Democratic reform, obviously that is something that is crucial. And we can look at that through the lens, for example, of international financial institution packages. So what can we do to stimulate needed reform there through the assistance that we will be getting through the IFIs. We can also be looking at how we stimulate a private sector investment. Energy diversification is another key area. And of course, repairing critical infrastructure. Of course, so much has been destroyed over the past 100 days or so. And then, of course, continue to provide Ukraine with the necessary security, military support it needs to be able to defend itself. So again, this is obviously a short-term, medium-term, and long-term effort that we have underway, and something that is very important, as was mentioned earlier. We're doing this in full partnership with Ukraine. They themselves are laying out for us their priorities, short-term, medium-term, long-term, and we are working to see how we can provide support and mobilize the international community to be able to resource those important objectives. I can say this is the most assistance we have provided to Europe since the Marshall Plan, and we continue to see strong bipartisan support for our efforts in Ukraine and the broader regions. So today we are not helping to rebuild vanquished foes. We are helping an ally, Ukraine, to recover and to grow and to protect itself. We are helping our European partners promote regional stability, cope with refugee flows, address economic instability, fight disinformation, and strengthen democratic institutions. Today, George C. Marshall's words ring just as true as they did 75 years ago when he said the United States and our partners stand ready to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. So now, just as we did then, we must work together to restore confidence of the European people in the economic future of their own countries and of Europe as a whole. That was another quote from George C. Marshall. So I will end with where I began. The United States and our allies and partners are committed to a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Thank you. Look forward to our conversation.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Derek. I think that partnership is a theme we are seeing throughout, right? Because it was the unique part of the Marshall Plan that it created those partnerships. So, Jonathan, I turn it over.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hard to follow the two previous speakers, but I'll do my best. And It's great to be here today at the Wilson Center as always, and appreciate the strong leadership on both on transatlantic relations, but in a number of areas where you lead. So it's great to be here, and also with the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation. Sometimes I suspect that the German Marshall Fund and your organization sometimes can get confused, but we too are a legacy of the Marshall Plan itself. GMF is our 50th anniversary this year, and our history is connected to the Marshall Plan. We were a gift to start GMF from the German government, in really as a thank you to the American people 50 years ago to support and strengthen transatlantic relations. And so being here today, we're part of that legacy and the work that we're doing with a number of governments in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine today, through our grant making and through our policy and leadership program. So really pleased to be here, and I promise I won't make this about GMF today, but I was told that I had to raise that from our front office.
We welcome that.
Thank you. But it's a pleasure, and I had an opportunity to work with Derek when I was at USAID, both when he was in Azerbaijan, but also in Moldova, and so I'm especially honored to be next to him as he sort of talks about the amount of support and what the U.S. policy is in the region. But I think we're in obviously an extraordinary moment in the Marshall Plan at 75. When you look back at the legacy of the Marshall Plan, of what it meant for those countries in Europe, also extraordinary that the United States at the time not only reached out to allies, but also to those that were enemies, Italy and Germany at the time, and to countries that became part of the Warsaw Pact, that the United States was thinking beyond, not just partners, not just allies, but making certain that we bring in those that might have also suffered during a war. And I think it's a lesson that we need to think about very closely today when we think about what the future of Ukraine looks like, but also what Russia looks like going forward as well. But I think from that, and we mentioned the OECD, we also mentioned a number of other institutions. If you think about it, that success, that democratic success, economic success, led to a number of European institutions: stability, security, democracy. Some would call it one of the waves of democracy. Huntington would speak to that. Occurred right after World War II, and it was jump-started with this funding. But the flip side is the success of this couldn't have happened without partners on the ground, without the populations on the ground. And so when we're talking today about Ukraine and talking about a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, I think about the extraordinary heroics of the Ukrainian people over the last 100-plus days, what they bring to the table when you think about our Marshall Plan for Ukraine. And I think you weren't wrong about describing some of the needs to address corruption and democracy. But when I see what Ukrainians have done, even since 2014, moving forward on an association agreement with the European Union, moving forward on a DCFTA, and moving the ball forward even on anti-corruption efforts with the support of the United States, with the EU, I think that the Ukrainian people are well placed to take advantage right now to move that ball forward. And I think the most important thing that we could, and this is something we could speak to, is that within the next couple of days, the EU will make a decision about candidate status for Ukraine. And I raise this because I'm part of a group that is sending out a statement as we speak today saying, we hope that the EU will move forward on this candidate status, because the EU project, just like it was post-Marshall Plan, was critical, and all these institutions that really brought together, even enemies together, to build, as you said, the most prosperous, wealthiest, most democratic space in the world, is exactly where Ukraine needs to be. And that doesn't preclude Russia in the future. I'm not holding my breath right now under the current leadership, but we need to look to open the door. And I think just as Marshall thought then boldly, and the United States did as well, to think about what Ukrainians bring to the EU in a way that I don't hear, unfortunately, and would hope to hear more about. And I think something that's different than occurred in the Marshall Plan 75 years ago is the United States couldn't have a better partner. Europe is, to have a partner like Europe together with the United States. Derek mentioned the support that the United States is providing. And as somebody who worked both on assistance and also worked on Capitol Hill and at State Department too, that amount of funding on the U.S. side, over $50 billion in a bipartisan way, which is critical because in the Marshall Plan, the government, U.S. government at that time also realized that they were going to have to sell this plan to the American people. So today we have bipartisan support in a significant way, but we have this extraordinary partner in Europe that is right there with the United States. So we didn't talk about the overall assistance being provided by the EU and European partners, but it's equally significant. And in many ways, the EU and a potential EU membership, full membership, is really critical for Ukraine in a number of ways. One, to deal with the macro assistance side, Europe is really, maybe more so than even the United States, has the resources to provide the type of support Ukraine is going to need. We didn't talk about overall funding levels. In late April, it was reported, I think the Ukrainian government said that they said it was about $600 billion in damage done. That was in late April. It's likely over $1 trillion or close to $1 trillion today. So Europe is going to have to play this critical role in providing the support of any type of Marshall Plan that comes out of cooperation both with the United States, international financial institutions, but also the Ukrainian government, which Derek spoke about, which is essential. You have to have buy-in from the Ukrainian people and leadership. President Zelensky has already set up funds and also mechanisms to provide support. I don't know if those will be the mechanisms that will be in place to fund this, but I think it's critically important that we think through this partnership and what we're looking at today to ensure that we have the right type of cooperation between the United States and Europe. I don't know if I'm going over time yet, but you just tell me. But I think this is really a legacy opportunity, both for Ukraine, Russia. I understand there's a terminology of concerns about the word humiliation. I don't know how that really factors in when you see the types of atrocities that are taking place in Ukraine right now, or that this was an unprovoked war, or that the previous military and illegal annexation of Crimea and in parts of the Donbass was also an act of aggression. I think most important now is to find a way forward to support Ukraine's Euro integration process, to make certain that when there is a moment that there is an opportunity at the negotiating table, that Ukraine is in its strongest possible position to be able to negotiate with Russia. And one that won't necessarily change the military balance, it's this association, this Euro integration component. And I believe already the Marshall Plan is already being implemented. You can't wait, but what we're already seeing is what Derek mentioned too, is support for rebuilding certain parts of infrastructure that we're seeing, ensuring we have some energy experts and infrastructure experts in the audience, so I don't want to run afoul of some of them Ukrainians here, but a lot of work is already being done to advance and support this effort. So let's not just say that the Marshall Plan is future. I think it's already happening with the assistance being provided. My only hope is that over the next several months that we match this economic and Marshall Plan with the security needs of Ukraine. I can't see a successful Marshall Plan for Ukraine. What's different between the Marshall Plan 75 years ago and today is we're still in the middle of a war, which was mentioned, and we understand that, and we don't know what the outcome will be. But when you look at the military needs and security needs, in order for Ukraine to succeed, it will have to be as strong in terms of security as it will economically. And so I've yet to see sort of that balance yet of what security will ultimately look like for Ukraine. I understand that every day there's lines that are shifting on the battlefield, but it's particularly important as we think about this, that when we look back 75 years ago, there are some differences and some things that are similar, but one of them is security. And as long as Ukraine has a neighbor that's unwilling to recognize Ukraine's existence and is willing to move borders at a whim, then we have to make certain that there is a security component, and that includes, I hope, security guarantees for Ukraine. I'm not going to spell those out, but we need both. And so if we're talking about really succeeding, and I think what was said earlier about planning, it really does need that type of planning that you spoke about. And I know you spent a lot of time also in the Balkans working on these best laid plans and strategies. I also hope the Balkans is included in that candidacy push as well. I'm all for expanding this Marshall Plan to include Eastern Europe as well, but also the Balkans. Europe should shoot big, should think large, and the United States needs to provide support and leadership alongside the EU and Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was terrific. Gave us a lot of food for thought. And you're right to raise the security aspect, because it's one of the things that we've seen in the argumentation that has been out there in the blogosphere of, okay, how do you perform this assistance given the security difficulties that Ukraine is now facing. So that will be a factor, and I look forward to a little further discussion of that. I'm going to turn the floor over to Joe now from the Kennan Institute, because Kennan is, of course, our premier Wilson Center Institute for studies of this region. So if I can ask you for a few words as well.
Thank you very much. I'm very proud to be on a program with the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation. The foundation's mission is to improve American understanding of Austria, but the reverse as well. My own institution, the Kennan Institute, our mission is to improve American understanding about Russia and the wider region, including Ukraine. So in the words of President Wilson, which are engraved below in the hallway, you can see it as you go out, we are very much engaged in a common enterprise. So we've had a great start on discussing the lessons of the Marshall Plan for Ukraine. I will observe, as others have, that we are still stuck in the Lend-Lease phase of this situation. But that aside, once we reach the other side of the war, the Marshall Plan will be first and foremost on everyone's mind in relation to post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. So in advance of that, I would caution that we need to keep in mind more than just a great leader, a visionary plan, and a hugely successful outcome for Europe decades ago. The Marshall Plan was a logical extension of the U.S. containment policy against the Soviet Union, a policy that was inspired by Ambassador George Kennan in his long telegram and X article. Kennan was never succinct. Unfortunately, Ambassador Green left, so he can't hear that. But I don't say that because I'm here representing an institute bearing Kennan's name, at least not only because of that reason. My point is that the Marshall Plan was one of several interlocking policies put in place to win the peace in Europe, while at the same time guarding against the expansion of Soviet influence or form of government by capitalizing on the instability and hardships in post-war Europe. Other elements, such as Bretton Woods, international financial organizations like the IMF and World Bank, GATT and WTO, NATO, these are all other extensions of the containment policy. So what you can conclude from that is we cannot expect to invoke the precedent of the Marshall Plan and expect to generate the resources and political wisdom and will needed to meet the scale of devastation in Ukraine. Though if we were somehow to succeed in doing that, that would be the easy part. The harder job is going to be reaching a final political accord with Russia that gives Russia a stake and a voice in European security, but only on terms that respect the sovereignty and security of Russia's neighbors. Like I said, post-war reconstruction of Ukraine may seem easier in comparison. But if we fail to reach that accord with Russia, it risks another panel sometime in the years or decades to come about lessons for the Marshall Plan for the next post-war reconstruction job in Europe. And with that, I'll conclude and get to discussion.
Okay, leave us on a provocative note there. Okay, thank you so much. All right. I'd like to open it up for questions, and because we have the joy of having an in-person audience, I am going to turn it over to you. Let me just ask you to wait for the microphone, because that will be a help, and that way our online listeners can actually also hear you.
Hello, thank you very much.
I think you'll need to turn on the microphone.
Yeah.
Alex, any hope? All right. In that case,
Alex, you bring it to me. I can turn it.
all right. 1 minute for tech support. There we go. Excellent. All right.
Thank you very much. My name is Olena Pavlenko. I'm from Ukraine, from Kiev. I'm a president of Dixie Group. This is a think tank which works on energy policy in Ukraine, in Europe, also Ukraine, Europe, Russia energy relations. I would like to make a short comment and then 2 questions, if I may, within 1 minute. So I have to comment Mr. Petrich's statements, like divided Ukraine, corruption, and have a common vision of Ukraine and Russia. I believe, Mr. Petrich, Ukrainians have like 100% different vision of Marshall Plan than you have. So divided Ukraine, I don't think so. We never have been so united as we are now. And if we mean territories, I want to assure you that we are discussing now that the Ukraine will be as united as possible very soon, also in terms of territory. Second, regarding corruption, we have to discuss this definitely, but we also can talk about Minister Karen Kneissl, right? The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria, who was dancing with Mr. Putin and then was in Rosneft. So this corruption, this is the issue which we all should definitely discuss, but maybe not the only Ukraine is the country with problems. And also vision of Ukraine and Russia. I wanted to say that this war is about that how Ukraine is not Russia and how Ukraine should be discussed as part of the Europe and European Union. And I would really ask all of you, please, in your future programs, please do not make this mistake. Do not organize Ukraine and Russia programs. No, Ukraine and the EU programs, and Russia separately. Please, I think I will speak on behalf of all Ukrainians here. And my 2 questions will be probably to Mr. Hogan. One is, do you think there is a political will for G7 leaders to make a sort of public statement that all Russian frozen money will go for rebuilding of Ukraine? We think that mid-age Russians, those people who still will have to live in Russia, should know that they will pay for decades for what Russia did for Ukraine. That's fair to say this publicly, and that would be good if political leaders could say this. And my second question is regarding Marshall Plan. So we discussed 3 elements of such Marshall Plan. One is that there should be a very fast and transparent mechanism to provide support to Ukraine, financial support. Second, there should be a localization and engagement of a lot of local stakeholders to this rebuilding plan. And third is, of course, green recovery. So all modernization which is possible should be in place. Could you please comment on these 3 elements? Should they be a part of this Marshall Plan? Maybe something is more priority or some less priority. Thanks a lot.
And I'm going to add another question in there because we have one online, and that is any estimates on the ultimate price tag of this plan? And I hope you don't mind me adding that to your questions as well. All right. Derek, do you want to take a start?
Sure. I think, let me just start off by saying I think you're absolutely right that there should not be no grouping of Russia and Ukraine together. Certainly, I hope you didn't hear that from my comments. Ukraine has made a choice about its vision, and we support that. Unfortunately, Russia has as well made a choice, and that's a vision that we clearly do not support. And so that's why we've launched the largest unprecedented regime of sanctions against Russia for the choices it's making with respect to Ukraine's territorial integrity, its sovereignty, and its independence. And so fully agree with your point there. When it comes to the G7 and the leaders making a public statement about that, I can't say what will be in that statement. It's still very much a work in progress. I know that you've heard from the U.S. administration very much the intent, the desire to have Russia, the frozen assets, be part of any reparations package. The challenging part is just how, right? There are a lot of legal considerations there, not just for United States, but also for other G7 members as well. Doesn't mean the work isn't being done, but I just want to make sure you know that this is something that is much easier said than done. In the meantime, we are very much working on again, how do we strengthen our sanctions package again, and that's something that we are in close coordination with G7 member states on. I'll stop there.
Ambassador Petrich, I believe you wanted to answer as well.
Yes. To my Ukrainian colleague, this is a misunderstanding. I did not mean that Ukraine society is divided. It is the country, the latest since 2014, when Crimea was illegally taken away from the Ukraine. And of course, the two oblasts, Luhansk and Donetsk, which are under rebel and, in extension, Russian occupation. So this is clearly that the war that is underway has actually accelerated the nation-building process in Ukraine across ethnic and linguistic borders, so to speak. I think this is important to see, and I believe this is the greatest strength and makes me the most optimistic about the future of Ukraine. But of course, we cannot just say there are no problems around. I think we need to be very honest, particularly in such an environment. Yeah? And I fully appreciate that we need to fully support the fight of Ukraine against Russian invasion. Yeah? But I believe in order to be successful in an eventual so-called Marshall Plan for the Ukraine, we need to define and focus on those dysfunctional issues from the past and anticipate its resolution. Then I believe this will be successful. Now, the costs, of course, are staggering. This is a number which the price tag, as you call it, Ramin, is just enormous. But I don't believe that this is the biggest challenge. Yeah? If you invest in a project which has the right preconditions, which fulfills these conditions, then every single euro and dollar is well invested. But you need to provide for these preconditions to be fulfilled. I also see the issue of what can, and this is so very American, what can you do for the country? What can you do for your own country? And I believe that there is a huge number of very rich billionaire Ukrainians. I'm not talking now about how this wealth came all about, who are ready already, some of them at least, to contribute to the reconstruction. I'm just mentioning one. This is Mr. Akhmetov, the owner of Mariupol's steelworks, Azov. He has already publicly declared that he would do everything and provide the financial means that he has for the reconstruction. And I believe that there are thousands and more thousands of rich Ukrainians who do the same. Plus, as Derek had said, of course, we need to look, and this is what the European Union is doing, into the frozen assets of the Russian oligarchs. Some of them are very much interconnected with the Ukrainians, as we know. I believe we need to find a way so that Russia will contribute to the reconstruction of Ukraine. They are the ones that have destroyed the physical infrastructure of Ukraine. I think that's something which we need to move very carefully. Lawyers have to check and double check it, but I believe and I'm optimistic that there is something in there which could indeed fulfill this wish. Because you need to keep in mind that the repercussions of the war have hit Europeans, I have already mentioned Africans, the food crisis and all this stuff, but also we have the highest inflation now since 40 years in Europe. We have the highest energy prices since, again, another, I don't know how many years, as a direct consequence of the war. Clearly, it is Russia to be blamed and not Ukraine. But when it comes to the taxpayers in democratic countries to contribute to the reconstruction, we have to really appeal to them and tell them that this is necessary and that we can do it, that Europe can manage it. Because, again, I repeat myself, the European Union, one of the richest parts in all of the world, can afford this and should afford it, because the investment into Ukraine will be the best security guarantee for the European Union. That is something. And one last point, I believe that the war, this terrible war in the Ukraine, will give European integration and, so to speak, European nation building a big boost. That's important, yeah? And unless the European Union manages this in its very own interest, it's not going to survive a war which takes place from Vienna only 400 kilometers away. And that, I believe, the Europeans need to understand the interconnectedness which I've mentioned before, and that we are best off to follow the spirit of Marshall and say this is a win-win situation if we do something. This is actually what I would call enlightened self-interest.
Since we're going to lose one of our panelists in a couple of minutes, I'm going to wind it up. And I will say this. I think that one of the things that we learned from all of the panelists is the importance of planning and the importance of bringing creative ideas to this challenge and to this new way of trying to help rebuild Ukraine in these circumstances, which are so challenging. And so the importance of planning, we see a variety of ways in which already President Zelensky has established a portal for people to contribute. We are seeing the European Union grapple with ways that contribution can happen. We are looking ahead. There is a conference in Lugano in this July on the Ukraine recovery. So I think with all of that, what we are seeing is a step-by-step planning that is so critical to dealing with this issue in the next months and years. And so that is what we will hope for. I thank all of our panel participants, and I know there'll be a little lively discussion in the corridors as we wrap this up. Thank you so very much for coming, and especially to our online participants. Thank you.